Today is October 30th, 1984. I'm Joe Todd. This is an interview with Mr. Andrew Lester and Bertha, a.k.a. Judy Lester. Okay. Mr. Lester, when's your birthday?
November 14, 1914. I was born during the first blizzard of winter in a sod house that my grandfather built in Cheyenne, Oklahoma. He was an 89er.
What was your grandfather's name?
Morgan Lester.
Miss Lester, when's your birthday?
My birthday is January the 29th, 1916. Ditto, born in Cheyenne and same heritage.
On my father's side, I'm an 89er, and on my mother's side, her father was the grandson of Davy Crockett.
Great.
Tell me about your lineage back to Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett married Polly Finley, and she was a direct descendant of Macbeth, whose name was Findleigh, and her name spelling was Findlay. And she married Davy Crockett, taught him how to read and write, and then their daughter Margaret married Wiley Flowers, and Wiley Flowers married and had a son named David Finley Flowers. He married and had a daughter named Della Lou Flowers. She married and had a son named Andrew M. Lester, and my sister.
Plus another brother and two sisters.
Have you heard any stories about the Alamo from your family?
Well, not from my family, because basically I think they repeat what's written in books and newspapers and magazines, and some of it is true and some is not true. But I resent people referring to Davy Crockett as having hidden among mattresses, and that Mexicans found him and drug him out and killed him, because that's not his nature. He fought with his daddy when he's 14, ran off from home and went to Baltimore and thought he'd be a sailor. And he was on his own the rest of the time. And during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the bankers and the money men of New York and Philadelphia featured him and brought him over, and he gave talks, and they liked his sense of humor. He was a frontiersman, but he had refinement and delicacy. He had decency and culture and refinement. And Andrew Jackson didn't have that, and they resented it. And if he had lived through the Alamo, he'd have become president, because in Philadelphia they made a gun that he called Betsy according to his specifications. But now my brother-in-law was a Creek Indian, and he told me stories that aren't in the books that were handed down. And he said that Davy Crockett was one of the best friends the Indians ever had. And he was a scout and a frontiersman in the early days when Andrew Jackson led a group of regular army men or recruits to avenge the burning and the sacking and the killing of some Indians. And some Creeks were warlike and others were very peaceful. And Davy Crockett lived by these peaceful Indians, and when he was with Andrew Jackson's brigade, he saw this village, and he went in, he says, burn it to the ground and kill everybody. And the men were off hunting, and Davy Crockett and the frontiersmen that were with him dropped behind rocks and tree stumps and pointed their guns at the other army and said, over our dead bodies you fight this battle. And those men were afraid to fire on them because they couldn't get out of the woods alive, you see, without scouts. And Andrew Jackson just hated his guts from then on. And so he didn't like Andrew Jackson's idea of moving the Indians out of Oklahoma, to Oklahoma over the Trail of Tears. And he fought him on the bank question and on the tariff, because Davy Crockett said, you can't have these men going west and setting up farms without protecting them with tariffs as they ship their grain down to New Orleans. And then he said the bankers in the east go out west and start a bank, and then they abscond with the money. So the federal government ought to regulate that. And so when they told the Indians to gather in a church without their weapons to talk about peace, they put them in wagons and chains and started them off, and then stopped a few days out and said, write to your families and tell them if they don't leave their homes and follow you to Oklahoma, they'll never see you again. And so the Indians wrote these letters to their families, and so they just left. And many children were educated in Oxford and Cambridge, and these Indians were doctors and lawyers and merchants. They weren't, and they were called the 5 civilized tribes. And so on the way out, the Indians began to not eat the food the soldiers gave them. And they began to go and scratch among the droppings of the mules and horses to get the grains that were undigested, and they'd eat those. And so some of the soldiers had lived among the Indians. They said, give the Indian a rifle, let him go out hunt deer and game, and they'll come back and feed themselves and feed us. And so the army man didn't believe him. And so they told him, you take, and they sent several of them out with guns, and they said, if you don't come back, we're going to kill 5 or 10 of these that are left. Well, they kept their word. And so over a period of from fall to winter and spring of the next year, so many died on the Trail to Oklahoma. They call it the Trail of Tears. And I've done a Trail of Tears Madonna, which is on exhibit at the Oklahoma County Historical Society Museum. Now, my sister has an item about Davy Crockett.
Oh, yes, I remember the story told about him. As you know, he was senator for Tennessee. He served 2 terms. And I don't know which of the terms.
Congressman, I think.
Congressman,
yes.
Thank you. And when he was running for, I don't know if it was the 1st or the 2nd term, there was this story about him. He, of course, to pay for the liquor that he wants to serve to the men to get on his side, what he did, he had a lot of furs because he was known as a very good hunter. And however, the men still wanted a few more drinks, and he ran out of furs. So what he did, he just excused himself and went out in the woods with his Betsy, and he was gone long enough that it seemed reasonable that he had killed 1 or 2 animals and brought them in. Of course, they were so drunk they didn't notice that they weren't fresh killed skins. But what he really did, he went around the back of the place where they were drinking, and he reached between the logs and pulled out enough skins to come back and say, well, okay, set them up again, Joe. And however, when he kept a mental note of what the charge would be, or the cost would be, and then when he became congressman, he sent a letter and the amount of money it would have been for the cost to this man. But the man returned and says, anyone that's clever enough to fool me, he said, I deserve it and I don't want your money, so he sent it back. Then there's another story I remember at the end of his 2nd term, of course being very disillusioned by Andrew Jackson's antics, as my brother just mentioned. He was in the men's room and he was looking in the mirror, and someone heard him say, I am now looking at the last honest senator or congressman leaving these halls. And through that disillusionment, that was what prompted him then to go to Texas to fight for the independence of Texas. And of course, most of the rest then is history. And as I understand from history, what the government was doing, if anyone was in Texas for 30 days or more, they were to receive a land grant of X.
1,280 acres, I believe.
Is that what it was? And the land that he would have, that he had asked for, was where the city of San Antonio now sits. However, he was killed before the 30 days had passed. Therefore, he nor his family received this heritage.
Well, now, the way I get it is that everyone who fought in the Alamo or fought for independence were to receive 1,200 and some acres. And my mother said her daddy was on a farm in Gainesville, Texas. And some men came out there and said, we can legally get you this land, and we want this much. So they went back, and then they came back to see him again, and then they raised their ante as their commission. He said, if you want that, he said, before it's over, you'll take it all, so just forget it. Yeah. And so my grandpa on my mother's side came to Oklahoma and settled in western Oklahoma. And my father was born in Kansas. His mother died at birth. And his father fed him on mare's milk to keep him alive. And he wrote a letter back to Tennessee, and an old sweetheart or a girl he knew back there, and she came out and married him. And my dad was so mischievous that when he was 8 years old, she said he's got to go. And so he let him go, told him, or anyway, to his sister's place in Elk City. Her husband owned a harness shop. And he got so mischievous at age 14 that she had to say go. And he went to Oklahoma City at the age of 14. And at the age of 19, he never had a mother or a home. At the age of 19, he walked along the street, and on the corner down at Reno and Robinson, there was a Salvation Army playing on the street corner. And he heard them, and he liked them, and he gave his heart to the Lord. And he started playing drums. And when his daddy found out that he was playing drums for the Salvation Army, he bought a brand new wagon, new harness, and bought a team of mules and came after him. And my daddy cried all the way from Oklahoma City to Cheyenne, Oklahoma, but he couldn't say no to the daddy he loved, but he wanted to stay with them. And so he went to church meetings, and he saw our mother there, and she saw him. Well, he perceived her as a religious woman that wouldn't mind going evangelizing the world. Well, she saw him as like his father, stay-at-home, good old farmer. Well, they married, and they were out of step with each other.
Well, his dad's father was not just a farmer. He was also an educator. When he came from Tennessee, he settled in, according to the story I understand, they settled in Winfield, Kansas, and he always had the ability to make money, he had the first and only mercantile store there, and as I say, he was an educator. He also taught in a school, and that's as far as I know.
Why did they move west?
Itchy foot. And I've been reading some things my mother wrote about my daddy, and she said he was my tumbleweed.
And you say your grandfather made the run of 89?
Yes.
Where did he settle?
I think he staked out the lot down there near Harvey and First or something like that, somewhere in that area. And then he sold it and went out and ran for land in Roger Mills County, and then sold it. But my cousin Speck owns his land now.
What run was that in Roger Mills County?
I don't know. I think
was that
in
93 or
99 in the 90s. I think.
Okay.
Yeah. And then he was pretty old, and he went back to Tennessee for something and died on the train, and his gun and his possessions and everything were confiscated by someone.
Whenever he made the run for the land in Roger Mills County, what kind of house did he live in after the run?
Well, first a dugout, and then about a two-room house. And then when I was 4 years old, I can remember, that's the first big thing I can remember, we got on a train and came to Oklahoma City, because my dad just was not a farmer. But he wanted to farm to please his father. So when his father passed away, he wanted to come to Oklahoma City.
Did he ever talk about the dugout?
No, I don't remember that part.
Mom was in
Mom told me about those things.
Yeah.
And my dad went to get the doctor you know, afternoon can be shiny sunshine. In a couple of hours, it could be a blizzard. Well, as a blizzard came and he couldn't get back with the doctor couldn't get back till the next morning. And I was born that night. And my two sisters woke up when I was born, and they said, "What you got there, Mommy?" She said, "I got a brother for you." So my name was Brother until I was about 10 years old. And so then Dad moved to Oklahoma City, and we lived out there on South Harvey on school land that he improved on. And then he went out to Meridian Avenue between 36th and 23rd Street and bought 10 acres. And I was reading magazines about Guts and Borglum and other people carving out of frozen turnips, frogs and things. And so I carved a buffalo bull out of sandstone with a pocket knife. And there's an 89er that lived near me. He came in the run of 89 from Missouri on gray mule with a man that was the director of this historical society. He said, "Andrew, they'd want that out there." So he put me in the Model T Ford and came out, and this man put it in the museum. It's still here, 1931, I think. Then he told me, he said, "If you don't drop out of high school, I'll buy a brand new V8 Ford and let you drive it and pay all expenses when you graduate to the Alamo to see where Davy Crockett died." And so the week after I graduated, he bought a brand new V8 Ford. And I mean, I was on cloud nine driving that car, you know, V8 down to Alamo. And we got down there and he started bragging about me being a Boy Scout sculptor. because I'd done a bust of Abraham Lincoln that won first in the county state fair without a teacher in art.
Through the Boy Scouts.
Through the Boy Scouts. And so they said, why not now? Why should he wait till he gets through college? So he came right back to Oklahoma City, and I did a bust. And Dr. Jenkins, who was doing busts of governors, he was a friend of my mother. She worked for him at one time.
He was a dentist.
And he taught me how to mix clay and plaster.
Now, where was he located, Dr.
He was located over here by 23rd and Classen, or someplace in that area. He lived there. He was a dentist in Oklahoma City.
He was a dentist there.
Van Heflin's daddy was a dentist too, and he was a friend of Dr. Jenkins.
While you were talking about Cheyenne, don't you want to go?
My uncle was Uncle Jim Lester, and he was my favorite uncle. And he told me about when they picked him to be the sheriff. He said the only reason they picked me for sheriff, I could whoop anybody in the country. And during the early days, the whites used to enjoy getting Indians drunk and put them on Indian ponies that were not broken and having a lot of fun out of them. And Ben Whiteshield, the chief of the Southern Cheyenne, and he was a descendant of the Southern Cheyenne that Yellow Hair Custer had attacked near Cheyenne, Oklahoma during a snowstorm and killed a lot of them, and they were at peace with the government. They had signed peace treaties, but the Northern Cheyenne hadn't signed peace treaties.
Battle of the Washita?
The Battle of the Washita, yes. And Uncle Jim told us stories about, he told me the story about a man that was well, anyway, he made moonshine, and he's neglecting his family. And he had put out word that if Jim Lester came out there, he's going to do him in. So Jim took his guns off and went out there, and the man was sitting on the porch. Shotgun was laying up against the house, and he was sitting there, and so my uncle went up and pulled out a chaw of tobacco and said, I need your knife. So the guy gave me his knife. It must have been a whopper. And he cut off a slice, put his mouth, and offered some to him, and he wouldn't accept it. So then he just broke it off on the post of the porch.
Broke the knife.
The knife blade off, and slapped him on both sides of the cheek until he was dizzy. And he said, you shape up. No place for you in the jail. You're a father and you're a husband, and and the man shaped up after that. And then one time the Elk City called up him and said there's somebody that robbed the bank, and they're heading up toward Cheyenne. So he and his wife got in a Model T Ford, and they parked it on a bridge at the bottom of a hill. And his wife got under the bridge, and he walked on up the road a ways behind some weeds. And so when they came down over that hill, they had to stop. So he yelled at them to get out of the car and throw their guns out. And then his wife sent a shotgun, so they knew they were surrounded. So they picked him up and took him back to Elk City. You know a story.
Okay,
Yeah.
now,
Yeah,
excuse
go
me.
ahead.
I was just going to say now, there's one thing that I believe is important, and that is that Uncle Jim was the liaison between the federal government and the Indians when it was still a territory there in Cheyenne. And then, of course, when it became a state, he became sheriff.
Now, was he an Indian agent?
No,
No.
not exactly.
No, just
I guess they used him as public relations. We'd call it public relations today.
When did he become sheriff?
Oh, back in around before the 20s and during the 20s and
He was
30s.
after statehood then.
well,
After statehood.
After statehood.
Hey, was he sheriff in Roger Mills County?
Yes.
for-
Okay.
Now another thing about him and Ben Whiteshield, the chief of the Southern Cheyenne, the Indians in the early days would kill game on their way to a rendezvous or to town. But when they built fences and the farmers killed off the game and the only thing left was cattle, when they saw stray cattle, sometimes even the cattle inside a fence, they'd go and get it and butcher it. But that was, to them, that was just their normal. And so he and a friend of his started a butcher shop in Hammond, Oklahoma. And they gave the Indians orders, don't you kill a beef on the way to town. You come on into town and we'll supply you with meat. Okay, and then he gave him a 40-star flag. And he said, anytime you're in trouble with whites, and whites are always aggravating them, and then the Indian want to retaliate and get even, then there was a problem. So he gave him this flag, and he said, put it on your barn, weight it down with rocks, and I'll see it up on the road, and I'll come over. And so in the 60s, I was getting a master's at OU and a PhD, and I went to visit this Indian family, the descendants of Ben Whiteshield. And I met Mrs. Savage, who gave a brick building, a 2 or 3 story building, to the Indians for a center and a museum. But when she died, the whites collaborated with some Indians, and they took it away from the Indians, and it isn't being used for that.
Where is this located?
In Hammond, Oklahoma, yes. And they showed me this flag that my uncle had given them, and they had tears in their eyes, and they told me. And I said, you give me a picture of Ben Whiteshield, and I'll do a bust of him. And I couldn't make connections to donate it or dedicate it or anything. It's still in the Oklahoma County Historical Society building, and I'm an artist in residence there, and I've talked with Earl Metcalf and with those people, and sometime between now and 1989, I will donate this, or they will donate this bust of Ben Whiteshield to the Black Kettle Museum. And I want to do a bust of Jim, my uncle, to show the friendship that did exist between the white and red brothers. And I believe too that the blacks, the whites, and the Indians are the 3 ethnic basic groups. And the whites encompass all the races, English and Irish and Dutch and French and so on. That I feel that these 3 racial people, ethnic, should be represented in Oklahoma history. And when I taught in California during the Watts riots, and the blacks were spilling out from Watts into the other areas, I lived 60 miles away, I would help the Indians, and I would help the blacks understand discrimination by this story. I would tell them, when the Great Spirit built and created the world, he created flowers of many colors, because when he picked a bouquet, he liked the bouquet. So he planted the different races on the earth, because when he wanted the people to come with him, he liked a bouquet. And I said, you don't find a rose telling a violet, you're a half-breed, you don't fit in with this bouquet, you get out, because you're mixed with me and the blue daisy or whatever, you see. And I said, when God made me, he isn't finished with me yet. I'm half done, I'm half baked, I'm white. But here, when he made you, he said, oops, I burned another one. And then when an Indian comes along, or a Japanese, or a brown skin, he says, I did you just right. I let you out of that oven just in time, And so they had to laugh at me, and they had to laugh at themselves. And so laughing, I said, we're here to help each other. That as a teacher, I'm a learner, because I learn to know you better and how you learn, and I can help you. And so when they begin to tear up the rooms and destroy things, they always left my room alone. And other teachers say, how do you manage that? And I said, I'm an Oreo. They perceive me as black inside, chocolate, and vanilla on the outside.
I have a question. You told one story about your uncle taking a prisoner on the train.
Yes. You want to tell that?
All right.
Oh, you told me.
Okay. Yes. Excuse me. Yes, Uncle Jim was told to go to Kansas and pick up a desperado as prisoner and bring him back to Cheyenne for trial. And on the way back on the train, Uncle Jim had a heart attack. So when they reached the next town, they took him off, took him to the hospital, and of course, in going through his things, they saw that he was a sheriff. So they called their local sheriff, and he realized that he had papers with him that he was carrying a prisoner with him as a passenger on the train. I must backtrack just a moment. Before they got on the train, Uncle Jim said, all right, look, he says, I'm going to take the handcuffs off, and we're going to travel just like 2 gentlemen. But I warn you, if you try to get away, I'll put a bullet from here to here or here to here, whichever way you're running from me. So they were getting along just fine. And then, as I say, Uncle Jim had this heart attack. And when the sheriff realized he had a prisoner, and he had noticed this stranger, being a small town, a stranger would be pretty conspicuous. He noticed a stranger sitting around the hospital grounds there. So he went out and he asked him, he said, why didn't you escape through all the confusion? You could have escaped very, very well, very easily. He said, he's the only man in my life that ever treated me like a man and a gentleman. No way could I leave him at this time. I had to know what happened to him. And I think in a nutshell, that encompasses what Uncle Jim was like. Then another story about Uncle Jim was there were 4 young men, very young, probably 16, 18, 19, long in there, when Oklahoma was still a territory. And they were cattle thieves and horse rustlers, or whatever you want to call them. And Uncle Jim decided he'd go out and bring them in. His deputy said, I better go with you because they're pretty dangerous men. And Uncle Jim said, no, 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 you stand behind the store. However, the deputy was still apprehensive, so he followed at a safe distance to see that everything was right. Well, the place where these people, these young men were holed up in was in a little low place, and there was a hill that Uncle Jim rode up on the rim of this hill, and he called down to him. Of course, he knew that they knew he was around. And he called down to him, and he said, boys, he says, I came to take you in. And they laughed. And he said, no, he says, I think you ought to come in with me and straighten up your life and straighten up the wrongs that you've done, so when Oklahoma becomes a state, then you can start your life on the right path. And so he says, I want to prove that I'm not going to use guns. So he took his gun belt off, laid it down on the ground. He says, all right, fellas, come on in. So sure enough, they said, okay. And so Uncle Jim got on his horse, and the man, of course, the deputy was watching all this and stayed hidden until they got back to town, and then he rode into town. And he was the one that told how Uncle Jim managed to talk these young men into coming on into town, and so their life would start out right. And while we're talking about Uncle Jim Lester, I must mention he had some wonderful children. One of them is Robert Lester, who is still works for the state of Oklahoma. And to backtrack just a bit, when he was a senior in high school, his sister's husband was a doctor, and across the hall from his office was a lawyer. I don't know his name, but he was the son-in-law who was the power behind putting Alfalfa Bill Murray in the governor's seat. So they were socializing this over the Christmas holidays, and my sister, my cousin, his sister, said, Oklahoma's getting to be a state big enough, we should have state highway patrolmen. So, of course, the son-in-law said, that's a good idea, but she says, wait until my kid brother, who was like 6'2" and 180 pounds, wait till he graduates so he can be in on the ground floor. So he was one of the original 7 state highway patrolmen, and stayed with them, of course, through all the years. And when he had served his full term where he could reach retirement time, then he was the head of the State Highway Patrol of Oklahoma. And by that point in time, then he had 2 daughters that was college age. And he was offered a job to be chief of police at Norman, Oklahoma, OU, which he accepted because that would be very good. So the family moved to Norman, Oklahoma. But he was very happy when his daughters got out of school, because that was quite a job to be a chief of police in a college town. And then he was offered a position to be head of the state safety patrol for the state of California, which he accepted. And I don't know if anything happened between that point, but the next known point to me of his position was chief liaison between all law enforcement and the governor, Governor Nye. And his office was right across the hall from Governor Nye's office. And that was 1981 when I was visiting that this happened. But now I'll turn this back to my brother. He knows more about his present position now. And Robert Lester is a dear, wonderful, honest person, not just because he's my cousin and the son of my favorite uncle, not just mine, but all of our family.
When I graduated, and Dr. E.J. Ortman came to Putnam City High School to give the commencement speech, and after the speech, the English teacher, Miss Johnson, took me by the hand and took me up to him, and she said, this boy has a lot of talent, and he doesn't have any money, and he has to work his way through college, so you're going to find a job for him, and he's going to write you a letter in August, and he's going to go down there the last week of August, and you're going to have a job for him. You understand? And all he could do was shake his head yes. So after going to the Alamo and having that dedication, I wrote a letter, and I got into town. He stayed home that day and answered the phone and came down the highway and picked me up and took me over to John and Grace Lee Frank's home. Grace Lee Bowman, before marriage, had been in his classes to be a teacher. And I met her at the door, and we were talking, and she said, I'm sorry, we don't have the money and we don't have a place for you. And I said, what about this tall grass in your yard? She said, well, John, just too busy to cut that. I said, then I'll cut it. She said, what if I don't have money to pay you? I said, someday when I'm hungry and you got an extra biscuit, I'll just come by and eat. So she said, go ahead and cut it. So I did. Well, eventually I was in their home, and they treated me like a son. And their daughter, who is about 50 years old that I babysat, is one of my dearest friends today. And so I was sitting at the breakfast table one morning, and he was thinking about renaming it from Frank Potteries. And I said, you should combine Oklahoma with Frankhoma, like Frankhoma, with Frank Potteries with Oklahoma, like Oklahoma. And Mrs. Frank said, that's the name. And so they've been my friends since 1933. And then in California as a teacher, I treated the blacks different than the other teachers did. I mean, I was colorblind. And if the kid was that much right, I gave him that much credit. And then the next year, he was that much right, and I'd give him that much credit. And as a result, during the time of Watts riots, when they'd break into rooms in the office and tear it up, they would never tear my room up.
How come you moved to California?
How come? Okay, I was at Oklahoma A&M College at Stillwater, and I graduated with a BA. In 1940, I went down to the NYA, and I said, you should have a pottery factory up here, teaching the kids how to make pottery from Oklahoma clay.
That was Stillwater, Oklahoma.
So Houston Wright made me a supervisor of ceramics. And when the war started, then they moved the Japanese into internment camps, and they took that equipment, and so the Japanese would have something to work with. And so I went to California, and I became a pattern maker.
An aircraft.
In an aircraft factory, and I became a foreman of a shop, and then I became a superintendent of a shop, and then I became an owner and a producer of ceramics, Lester, California, and my sister Judy here ran it for me, more or less. And then Pearl McManus, the lady in Palm Springs, California, who owned the tennis club, and you had to be a member before you got in there. And so she sent her business manager around to find some craftsmen who would establish a village workshop near Tahquitz Canyon. And he saw my shop, and he said, we want you. About a week later, Pearl came with him to see my shop. And then they were going to start this very soon.
Excuse
and
me.
then she turned to him.
Excuse me, it was McCullum, not McManus.
Okay, McCullum.
She and her father were one of the original white people in the Palm Springs area.
Well, anyway, she turned to him and said, when is the painter going to come and paint my house? And he said, I don't know. It's hard to find anybody. And I said, well, things are slow here. For $50 a week and room and board, I'll go down there and paint your house. So I went down and painted their house. And then I found out that they were going to start the Allied Arts Association in Palm Springs. And she was on the board of directors. And so I was down there, and I just loved the scenery and everything. And my sister said, well, if you get it down there and go to teach, you can come back here weekends and summers and do the heavy work, and I can keep the pottery shop going. And so I started teaching at Palm Springs High School, and they dedicated the yearbook to me, and I wrote 2 Indian pageants, put those on, and it was fun.
Now, at Stillwater, were you director of the NYA program?
Yes, NYA Pottery Project.
Okay.
On 6th Street.
Yeah, tell me what your duties were as director of the
Okay,
NYA.
as the director of the NYA Pottery Project, my duties required that I design the ceramics, the bowls and cups and saucers and all the other things that I made in cups. I design them, make molds of them, teach students how to make those molds, mix the clay, go out and dig it down in Ada, come back, mix it and screen it, and cast them and teach the kids how to cast and trim, and then fire them, and then glaze them. So it was just like a complete ceramic factory, and these kids, they were just great. And the way I treated kids was, we're here together, now let's work it out together. And it was just terrific the way they worked.
And then they used the pottery dishes
In the
for
camps.
tableware in the CCC camps.
No,
So
NYA camps.
Was it NYA camps?
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yes.
How were the NYA camps set up?
Well, they were set up through the federal government to the state. And because of politics there in Stillwater, in the camp, I went back to them and I told them my problems in the state office. So they canceled me out from that project and set me up as an independent project with students coming from the NYA camp to work only 50 feet away in military barracks on 6th Street.
Okay, so it was set up like a
Like a
military
factory,
camp then.
like a factory.
And the camp itself, was it like a military camp?
In a sense, yes, but but much more relaxed than a military camp.
Okay, now was it run by the military as in the
No,
CCC?
no, NYA.
Because the CCC had military in charge.
That's right, but the NYA was, it was well organized, but it didn't have the militant atmosphere.
Okay.
Yes.
How do you know which clay to use in your pot?
Well, Mr. Frank of the Frankhoma Pottery had been going down there and digging the clay out from a hill, and I knew exactly where it was, and so I didn't have to find the clay. He found it for me. And then when he moved from Norman to Sapulpa, he found clay near Sapulpa that was adequate. But you have to have a glaze that will be compatible to the clay. And
why did he move to Sapulpa?
why did he move? Norman, Oklahoma Chamber of Commerce were not interested in a business there. And he started the business, and he taught at the university. And when he left the university, my influence was gone because I was his student assistant at the ceramic department. And so I didn't want to go home and tell my mother I didn't have a job. So I went to the Boy Scout master's house, slept on the kitchen floor, and when I went to sleep I was worried, and I said, Lord, you're going to take care of things, because you remember I promised you there's only two ways I'm going to leave a university, in a pine box or with a degree. And it's up to you which is going to be. And so I said, now you take it and you handle it, because I'm going to go to sleep. I need the rest. I went out to the highway, to 23rd Street, May Avenue. I caught a ride with a man, and Stillwater's 70 miles away. In less than an hour, we were there. He drove 80 and 90 and almost 100 miles an hour. And when I got up there, I didn't know anybody except one man, one boy, Vernon McNeil, who's now teaching at the Bacon Indian School. So I walked in the White Rock Cafe, and I said, if I bring a chicken in here, how much of that chicken will you let me eat? And if I bring a bunch of strawberries or apples or something, he said, what are you driving at? I said, I'm going to be out working for people, and they don't have money. I'm going to get food. I want to bring it here. Now, how much can I eat? He said, if you're that kind of a person, he said, anytime you're hungry, you come here and I'll feed you. And I'd bring food in, and he'd give me, you know, he said, anytime you're hungry. Well, I started working for Doyle Reed in the art department, and people treated me real good. And I caught a ride with Dr. Bennett one day, and I said, I want to give you some art, and I want to give the dean some art, because without you people helping me, I had to have 2 or 3 jobs at the same time, you know, to make enough money to stay in school. I had 2 daughters and a son in escrow when I graduated. And my wife was a Trail of Tears, the Trail of Tears descendant, an Indian. And my son has been commissioner for Native American Indians under the last 4 presidents. Now he's located in Colorado, supervising the energy.
CERT.
Okay. So he said, Andrew, you can't pay us back. You have to invest in the next generation. And I decided right then not to be an artist, but to be a teacher. And so in the summers and winters and after school, I would do portraits. And they're scattered all over. Got Louis B. Mayer at Santa Clara University, Ike at his birthplace in Texas, 2 busts at the Alamo of Davy Crockett. I went back to get the first one because I said it wasn't good enough. They said, well, we're going to keep it, so you just make another for us. So my cousin married an oil man, and so he paid me for doing another bigger one in bronze. And, well...
Let's see, who is it that you have at March Air Force Base?
Oh, General Doolittle.
General Doolittle.
I took 14 pictures, and when I showed it to him in L.A., he said, I don't like the eyes. I said, what don't you like about him? He told me, and I started working on him. In about 30 minutes, he said, that's it. And my little girl was there, and she wanted his autograph right away. He said, business for pleasure, young lady. And so when I finished the bust, and he smiled, we got pictures taken, and he reached over and pulled her over in his lap, and he hugged and kissed her, and he said, the future of America is in the hands of our children. And so I met beautiful people, had wonderful experiences. When I did Cesar Chavez, and I gave it to the Chicanos at our school on the 5th of May, and when he walked into the hall, everything stopped and was quiet. And he'd go to one little group of people and talk, and everyone else just leave him alone. He'd go to another group of people and talk. And when he went all the way around and talked, then they'd pull my bust out, had it covered up, and they asked me questions about myself, and I told them. Then when he got up, he said, Andy Lester can talk for himself. And so I told about my going out and picking cotton and missing school until November and things like that. And I said the only escape I had from that kind of an existence was a college education, so that I could choose what I wanted to do. And when I finished, he came over. I said, Dios con Dios, mi amigo. And he turned to me, he says, and God walk with you too, my friend. And we embraced, and tears were in our eyes. and they began to clap like this and stomp their feet, and they got crescendo, and then I don't know who was the leader, but it was in unison. It was the most beautiful experience I've ever had. And I gave the bust of General Doolittle to Castle Air Force Base, March Air Force Base on the 40th anniversary of bombing Japan, and now it's out here at Kirkpatrick Center. And I've donated 6 busts to Oklahoma State University, 2 at Langston University, and 2 at Northeast State. And I'm back here to help implement scholarships, because to me, when we commemorate people who have died and have contributed, they're portrait memorials. But the real memorial are living scholarships and sponsors and donors of scholarships. Those are our living memorials, and that's what I want to do now. And I thank God for Penn Woods and the others who have picked me to be at that museum, because now I can.
Miss Lester, as a small girl, what chores did you do around the house?
What chores did I do? Well, I remember, of course, hoeing in the garden, and in those days you didn't have pesticides, so the way we got the potato bugs off the potato leaves, one at a time in the bucket. And then, when we had the bucket full, we would put kerosene and light it and burn it. And
Cremation.
And I remember, as a child growing up, if our cow had a boy calf, I think they call them bullets.
Bulls.
Bulls. If he had a boy calf, we had beef for the winter. But if it was a heifer, then we'd buy a little piglet, and by fall it would be a pig, and we would have pork, hog for the winter. And I remember we had a big cauldron in the yard that Mom would trim the fat off and render the fat and then add lye to it, and that was soap. It turned into soap.
Ashes.
Oh,
she
and
put ashes in there and
Oh,
it
yeah.
make lye soap.
Yeah, that's right, and ashes. And of course, this 10 acres that Andy mentioned that we moved out where we went to Putnam High School from the 3rd grade. I was in the 3rd grade at that time. And first there was 10 acres, and then Dad sold 5, so that left 5. The 5, though, that we lived on had several fruit trees, so naturally we would pick the fruit, would have it fresh, and then I would help Mom can. And vegetables, she never had much luck canning corn, though. It just didn't stay, but jellies and jams. And I remember we had a wild plum thicket that it makes terrific jams and jellies. But to get in there and pick those plums, it was really rugged. And we had berries, blackberries and dewberries, and a grape arbor. And so we were pretty self-sufficient. I also remember that we would grow calf corn. So then we would make the little haystacks for it to dry out, and then we'd put it in the barn for the winter. And calf corn has quite a head on it with a lot of seeds. And we would store that, and that would be the feed for the chickens. And then the stalks would be for the cows. And I also remember we had the pot-bellied stove and then the old wood stove in the kitchen to cook with. And of course, in the winter, there would always be forever that pot of beans on cooking while we were warming with the stove. And I also remember we'd go out and get cow chips, because that makes a real good, quick, hot fire. And I remember by the time I was 9 years old, 10, I was milking a cow most every morning. See, the 2 sisters one sister was staying with an aunt at different times. Of course, Andy, you heard his activities. And we have a younger brother, and he didn't like to chop wood. So I'd chop the wood, and if he'd help me wash the dishes. So that was a trade-off there. And of course, he didn't particularly like to work in the garden either. And I remember one time he was very young, and Mom gave us each the right amount of corn, so much corn, we would plant this corn. Well, he wanted to play. So what he did, he thought he was real cute. He put all the corn in one hole. Of course, nobody knew what happened until it came time for it to come up. And we discovered he put all his, well, of course I knew it, but I didn't dare tell Mom. But back to cows. I milked one cow night and morning from, I would say, 10, 11 years old until I got out of school. And then I went to the city and got a job. And part of that time, some of the time, we would have 2 cows. But my little brother, again, he just couldn't milk the cow. You know, she'd kick the bucket, and we couldn't afford to lose the milk. And so we always did some trade-offs for that. And needless to say, we did not have electricity until, well, I guess I was about a senior in high school. And so we learned from studying under a coal oil lamp. And it rather amuses me today. It seems that the schools, they have to raise so much money to put carpets in this and the fancy this and the fancy that. And we learned and helped build a pretty good foundation for the nation without air conditioning and without all these nice amenities, which I'll have to say I enjoy, and I'm glad we have them, and I'm glad we have them for them to enjoy too. But I think really that sometimes we give the children so much that they don't even know what to do with what they've got, and I think we rob from them the earning ability. We give them things before they even want it, and I think we rob them of the joy of wanting it and then getting it.
My mother would make sheets and underwear and things like this from flour sacks.
Oh yes.
And then sometimes from bran, we'd mix it with flour and cornmeal, and it made the best muffins. And you buy 100 pounds for about $1.
Well, the bran was for the cow, but then it was nutritious.
And we didn't need very much money because we lived off the soil. So I got a paper route, and we lived on Meridian between 23rd and 36th. And I started out, the paper route was 10 miles long. Before I finished, it was 20 miles long. And the winter of '29, it was pretty much of a blizzard, and people just were housebound. So my mother wrapped my feet with cloth and then gunny sack or burlap around it with wire, and I walked right over a fence post, and I asked for extra papers. The urban just failed to run just one day, so I didn't get papers, but I always ordered about twice as many papers because the Times boy didn't I was the news, and the Times boy didn't deliver. And I'd carry extra, and somebody would stop and say, "Can I buy an extra paper from you?" And I'd give it to them. They said, "How much?" I said, "Free, or how much you want to give me?" Because if I said that, they'd give me more than a dime. And so I'd give all the money to my mother, and she'd hand it for me. And then I got a chance to buy a Model T Ford from a mechanic, and it ran like a Cadillac. You remember Model Ts would chug, 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 a Cadillac it along? I mean, that car really was something. Then I got a chance to have a horse. A man was too poor to buy the feed. He said, "If you feed it, you can use it." And her name was Mary Jane, and she was half racehorse. And I'd stop at the corner of May Avenue and 39th Street. There's a filling station there and a store, and he'd come out and give me a Snicker or a Milky Way, and I'd break it half in two, and this horse would nicker and turn her head around. I'd feed her. I was up on her back, on a bareback, with a newspaper on either side to balance me off. And and then I bought a bicycle. So sometimes I just could deliver papers to half the route, and I'd carry double days, 2 days papers. And that was the money. Then the newspaper folded. About a month after, a boy came along and sneaked out, got that route away from me some way. He had a Model A Ford. And when he came out and took it from me, I said, the providence and the good Lord's gonna take care of you in that newspaper. And sure enough, about a month later, it folded.
If I remember correctly, at that time, when you went in to get the newspapers, you also sold newspapers on the streets.
Oh, I did that from the time I was 10.
Yeah, when you were younger.
I'd hitchhike into town and sell papers after school
on the corner.
At the YWCA cafeteria in Oklahoma City. And then I'd catch the last streetcar out. If I didn't have enough money and I wanted to save a dime or whatever it cost, I'd get on the cow catcher as it turned the corner, and people would see me, and I'd wave and do this, and they'd do that in the cars. And
the conductors, I'm sure.
And the conductor probably knew.
Sure.
And so when we got out the end of Linwood car line, I'd have about 2.5 miles to walk. If I hitchhiked, I'd have a quarter of a mile to walk from the highway.
Well, there were 2 streetcars that we could catch at that time. One was the city streetcar, as you mentioned, which was on Linwood Boulevard, and it ended at Portland. Was
No,
that the end of the line?
something like that.
Something near Portland was the end of
Yeah.
the city streetcar line. And from then on to our house was wheat fields and no houses or anything. Then there was an interurban that would go to Meridian and 39th Street. Now that cost a quarter, but the city streetcar cost a dime. But we had, like you said, 2.5 miles one way, but from the interurban it was a half a mile down to our
You know, there's a
house.
thread of character or characteristics in families, and I always initiated my jobs. The jobs I got, I sort of thought that it ought to be, and I'd go in, and sure enough, it would happen that way. And my son got a job because he thought up the idea of Urban Indian Development Association for California. And
which is you
before that, he went to Washington, D.C. to work in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I said, those Indians in Washington, D.C. are as alien to the Indians in the reservations as are white people. And he thought I was prejudiced. He went there and found out, so he went to Senator Tunney and Senator Kennedy and sold them on the idea of helping Indians help themselves. And so they initiated the UIDA program in California. And for instance, there's one Indian thought when you had to put the converters on gasoline motors or carburetors, he said to David, and David went to Governor Reagan, and he said, this boy wants to fix up a truck to travel around the used car lots to convert, put the smog controls on the cars, so they don't have to drive the car to the garage. But he wants to be protected, so he gave him a monopoly for 2 years. And he fixed up the truck and went around, and other white guys wanted to get in on it, and when they found out, they tried to get the certificate of approval, they couldn't get it from the governor. And so then Nixon asked him to become the Commissioner for Native American Indians.
When he took over the post of UIDA, United Indian Development Association, which was Nixon's administration, there were 3 Indian-owned or operated businesses in Los Angeles. When he left 8 years later, there were over 300. So that shows the progress of the man. And I might say, if you were to see his son, his name is
Antelo David.
Antelo David.
He goes by A. David.
A. David Lester. And if you were to see both of them here talking,
Our hands would be the same.
Exactly the same. It's fantastic, the similarity. And I will also add that he was the only Carter appointee that Reagan kept. And by that time, he was Commissioner of
Yes.
Native Americans. And since then, now he is head of CERT.
And while he was UIDA, he'd go into those dives in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and sometimes there'd be a dance, and the black would want to dance with his wife, who's Indian, and he'd say no, and then they'd create a problem. And there was a mafia of Indians that were looking after him because he's the only politician that would come down there and be with them and identify with them. Now, he would drink beer and other things with them, but I was a non-smoker, a non-drinker, and when the boys would feel close to me and we were around someplace where we could buy something like that and they'd want to buy something, I'd say, I really appreciate your offer, but I don't do it. And when these big blacks had come back from L.A. into San Bernardino to raise Cain with a teacher, and I was out there supervising, not letting interfere into the football game or a dance or something, a big black would grab me by the collar, and I can cut your throat. I said, that's right, I'm here to warn you, I'm here to teach. If they wanted me to fight, they'd have had a jackass or a gorilla, and they'd tear you up. And the smallest black would come up to him, not the big one because he'd have to fight. He'd punch him in the guts like this and call him a name, and he said, you leave our Oriole friend alone. You have to walk through me to get to him. And so the same thing happened to Beaver, that's what we called him, when he was in L.A., and the slummy people would come around him to bother him. Those street guys that these slummy people would know would walk up and say, you got to go through me to get to him. And I thought, you know, it's remarkable. We don't know the thoughts and the feelings and the confrontations and the challenges of our ancestry, but I believe with all my heart that genes and your breeding, no matter what you're taught, come through in the end. And one day my principal I called him and said I was sick, and he forgot to get a substitute. And I taught mentally retarded kids at that time. And I said, we're friends, and so if you can't do it, let somebody help you do it. We're doing this together. And I'd say, now, you're going to get an A today for listening, the first day of class. And I tell them the story that the Great Spirit wanted to create man in the world, and so he created me, unfinished, and then burnt the other one, and then the Indian. And I tell that to all of them. And then I would say the next day, now you're listening and following directions today. Now do you want to make another A? And I'd say, now you appoint somebody to come up here that can write and read, and they'd appoint a kid. They'd know who could do it, and they'd come up there and they'd be my secretary. And he thought, 10 minutes before 12, my goodness alive, that room's going to be a mess. He walked in the room. In other words, they had taken the absence and wrote the name down and put it up by the door, and the kids come by the office quite a bit. They didn't see me in the room because I'd be in the other part of the room where they couldn't see me. They didn't even know I wasn't there. Teachers on both sides of the room didn't know I wasn't there. And these kids did their work, put it away, and they always went with a pass to the restroom like I gave them. And they said, we don't need you, Mr. Klein. We can run this. We're a democracy. They told him where to go. They were real thrilled about it.
Well,
and I'd bring a TV in for the World Series. They wouldn't call it series, World Series. And he came in one day, he said, how can you justify this? I said, because it's their interest. They've earned the right. And I said, tomorrow you come back, and I'll show you how we justify it. So I told the kids, he wanted to find out what they got out of it. So one kid was real good in math, and he gave the batting average of the whole season, and his for the game. Another kid would write a letter to him telling him what happened. Everybody would have something to say. And he just shook his head. He says, I can't fight you. Other teachers want to bring a TV in, and he wouldn't let them, and they wouldn't let them, and the kids are mad. They thought they were dum-dums at the bottom, but they were getting all these breaks. And I taught at the University of California at Riverside. I'd take them to my classes, evenings and summers, and those teachers would meet them. They said, they're not special education. I said, oh, yes, they are. They rated that on the test, but they're not mentally retarded. If you treat them as equals, they'll rise at that level. And it was a thrill. And those kids, they'd tell everybody, we help Mr. Lester teach teachers how to teach our kind. I mean, it's just great. You know? And so, well, anyway. Oh, and I came back to Oklahoma with my car full of art, and I thank God for every mile I drove for certain things. For a commission, to be in a museum, to be in a gallery, and within 3 weeks, I got all those things. So I know I'm supposed to be here. I'm not pushing someone else out of the space that I'm supposed to be in.
Can you describe Oklahoma City the first time you saw it?
Yes, I remember the Puffabilly. I was 4 years old.
What year was that?
1918. And I got on the train. My cousin, Ruth, she's 14 years old. She picked me up at the Lester Homestead.
yeah, that's Bob Lester's sister.
And combed my curly hair. I had the hair curls clear down the hair until one morning they were going to church and they didn't have time to. And
Yeah,
so
he
they
had
cut
long
it.
curls till he was 4.
My dad had him till he was 6.
8.
Okay. And
He had 2 sisters that he was a doll, see, he lost his mother.
and I remember when we came on the train, we saw teepees along the Canadian River. Indians living in teepees. And you know, Cheyenne's a small town, but it seemed like the city lasted forever when you got in the middle of it. And one time my mother was going to church with us, and the car hit her and drug her 200 feet and broke her hip, and the doctor said it was going to disintegrate. And I remember out near Putnam City on our homestead, the wind was blowing and the house had little cracks, and that fine snow would come in like sand and cover the beds and the floors. And she was moaning and groaning, and I woke up and went in there. I said, what's wrong? And she said, my leg is killing me. And so I wrapped myself up in a blanket and sat on the floor and put my hand on her ankle. She said, you've got good hands, healing hands. And I asked the Lord to take the pain out of her leg and put it in me because I was young and I could take it. And I went to sleep. And she said that I just lay there and went to sleep. And she said that it never hurt her after that. And that was in the 30s. And she died in the 70s, and she was 94, and her leg never hurt her after that. And so I really believe, without getting on a soapbox and being a fanatic, I believe that I believe in God, and I believe that we're like roses or violets or other or sunflowers, because each one of us, if we reach our potential and live within ourselves, our real self comes out, then we're like a flower. We are like a wheat field. There's a harvest, and I've always believed in giving. And so when I come back to Oklahoma in 81, 82, 83, and 84, people have given me. And people used to say, you can't afford to give these kids and this and this and this. But you know, I just felt like when I need it, it's going to be there, and it has been.
Do you remember Armistice Day?
Yes, we had a pottery factory. And I wasn't called to the service because I had...
No, this is World War I, Armistice Day, 1918.
I remember my daddy coming back with a suit. You know, but he didn't have to go to camp because it was over before he went to camp. And that's all I remember, 1918. I was 4 years old. And then he worked for the city, and then he fell out of a tree or cut a tree down and fell on his leg, and he was hobbling along on crutches. But that didn't keep him from going to church. My mother's more practical.
Tell me about Oklahoma City in the Depression, the 1930s.
I remember when they issued script, and my sister was working in Oklahoma City. And the thing that is so different between the 30s Depression and today, there wasn't as much crime.
That people stole only when they were hungry. But I also remember one thing during the Depression. Mom would say, we're not poor, we just don't have any money. And I think that's a very great way to put it.
And our minister, I visited him, he's in his 80s, and he started Putnam City Christian Church. And I visited him in Colorado Springs. And he said, Andrew, your mother never came for baskets and food, Christmas and Thanksgiving. And we knew you were as needy as anyone. And I said, well, she had a lot of pride. And at OU and at Stillwater, when I was hungry, I'd drink a lot of water. And I walk on the grass instead of the sidewalk so I wouldn't wear out my shoes. And when I got the NYA job, and I got the WPA job, suddenly I was making $100 or more, better than $100 a month, and that was as much as teachers was making. And I began to make A's and B's. Before then, I wouldn't even have money to buy a book.
What do you do with the WPA?
I went to the city. They had moved from the old brick building to a new center, and I said to the mayor, can I have arts and crafts here if I get a WPA grant or something? And he said yes. So I asked him for the names and address of all the board members of the city council. And so I called the ladies up and I said, how would you like to learn pottery or leathercraft? Yeah, we'd like that. I said, okay, get your husbands to write a letter or to vote on it, and I want a letter from the mayor because I want to take it to Oklahoma City. I went to Oklahoma City and I said, I live in Stillwater. He said, are you going to school? I said, yes. He said, but we're not here to help you get through school. I said, look, I got a family and I got to live, and what I do with my time is my own business. Now, don't you go cutting me out of this. I've got a letter here. And I tell you, and then the mayor said, tell him I'm going to call up the congressman or something because this is your home and you need the job, and what you do with your own time is your own business. And then the last time I went up there I said, you know, you're reminding me of Hitler. And that really hit him. I mean, he got real mad. He jumped up, he was going to hit me there. And I said, this isn't democracy, what you're doing, trying to keep me from getting this job simply because I'm in school. I'm trying to invest in my life so that I can invest in the future of this country. And you're not going to pour it down like sand in a rat hole, you know. And so he finally gave me the job. And then when that played out, then I got the job with NYA. I hitchhiked down and talked to Houston Wright, and he sent me to a guy that knew Will Rogers personally. And he said $12,000. I said, look at that again. There's not that many zeros. $1,200 is all it would cost them to set up this pottery project. Because at Stillwater they had a lot of pots and a lot of machinery, and they used to make pots and things there. And I said, there's a lot of junk out there. And I went to Dr. Bennett, and he says, anything you want you can take and use for NYA. So between me and the shop that did welding, we reorientated these machines, I don't know what you call it now, redesigned them so they would fit the NYA.
What kind of man was Dr. Bennett?
He had insight, he was intuitive, he had vision, he had a common touch, and I heard from others that no matter what kind of a group he was with, he had a message for everyone, and he never repeated himself. And he taught the adult class in Sunday school at the Baptist church. I just loved him and worshipped him, and I wanted to do his bust. Oh, I did the bust of Bo Makovsky. Have you heard of Bo Makovsky? He started the music department at Stillwater.
Okay.
He was a his father died at birth in Bohemia. Now, you know, Bohemia is no longer in existence. And then his mother died when he was 14. His uncle taught him to play every musical instrument. His sister migrated to America and married an Irishman on the railroad in Nebraska. He came over and lived with them and worked at a cigar factory. And then he organized with some other boys a band, a symphony band that toured the prairies in a covered wagon. And he located in Woodward. And at the same time, he was a director for the Philharmonic band that played at the fairgrounds. And the Stillwater A&M president came and asked him, would you come and teach our boys to have a marching band so the military marches with Christmas? He said, absolutely. He got over there and he'd find a girl or a boy that wanted to take music, and he'd teach them. He could teach them any instrument. And he didn't graduate from high school, didn't graduate from college, and he had a music department with people with master's degrees teaching with him. And everybody loved him. But I hadn't met him, so when I was NYA supervisor, I called him up one day and I said, I want to do a bust of you. But I don't want you to tell anybody because it may not turn out all right. So I went over with my clay and made a bust of him and fired it at the kill out at the NYA camp. And then I gave the mold to the music department and just presented it to them. Well, they broke it. It's ceramics, and you drop it, it'll break. So they went over to John Frank's place and gave him the mold and said, make a mold of this. And so I came back to visit him in '68, and I saw this dry clay bust of Bo, and I said, I did that. He said, your name isn't on it. I said, I'm going to put it on big from now on. So I went back to Max Mitchell, who was his flunky. Well, I was a flunky of Doyle Reed in the art department. He was flunking music. And I said, I'm at OU, and they have a foundry there for casting in bronze. Why don't you cast this? Well, so in '69, it was their 50th anniversary of founding the Kappa Kappa Psi. And so I came back and they gave me an honorary membership, and I had a bronze bust. He passed away in '53. So I gave this to the university in 1942, and while I was there, I said, Hank I was about to retire, and they said yes. So I went over and talked to the man at the field house. I said, I want to do a bust of Hank Iba. How much you charge? I said, $1,500 bucks. He said, fine. So he raised the money, and I did a bust of Hank Iba, and it was dedicated at his last grave. Last game, not grave.
Yeah. What kind of man was Mr. Frank?
John Frank was born in Chicago, and they were very poor. And he went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and people helped him. And he joined the Salvation Army and played the tuba horn. And when he graduated from there, the secretary of the art department at OU picked him because he was 6 foot tall, because she was looking for a husband. That's a scuttlebutt, and I think it's pretty true. And he came there to teach, and he just had the common touch. He could talk to the highest, the most snobbish, the most sophisticated person, and he could talk to the most common person, and he had the common touch, and he was spiritual without being fanatic about it. And his wife's father was a minister for the Nazarene Church, and they went to the Nazarene Church, so I went to the Nazarene Church. And everybody I worked for would always have some kid in Sunday school that was chasing teachers out of the class. And they'd ask me, can you teach Sunday school? I said, you bet. They'll not chase me out of the class. So we'd always have a party on a Friday at somebody's house with ice cream and things. And so the kid that was honoring the last Sunday, I'd say, now I'm going to you take me down and keep me from getting up. And I always grabbed this kid and give him a Dutch rub, you know, until his hair burned. And he'd say uncle a few times. I say, you gotta be a Christian. You can't be a heathen anymore in Sunday school. And all the kids would jump on him and give him the Dutch rub. So just with peer pressure and everything, that's the same thing I did in school. The first day in school, I'd turn look around and I'd say, I'm looking for a heathen. Are there any heathen in this room? Nobody raised their hand. I said, thank goodness we're all Christian. We start from there. And it's crazy. Because if you act like no teachers acting, and they can't figure you out, then they got to wait to see what you're doing, you know. And so I got the first jump on them. And if somebody wanted to pick a fight or something with me, I waited until it was my timing. Like, for instance, my first teaching job at Pacifica High School in San Bernardino, there was a big black and a big Greek sitting next to each other. They were slapping each other and laughing and talking. I knew they were making fun of me. And I just stopped and looked at them, and then they'd stop. Pretty soon they were hitting each other real hard. They jumped up and slugged, and the blood started flowing. I waited till they got about 6 or 8 or 10 good lisks in. Then I got my pencil, walked up real slow and pushed him aside. I said, give me your name. You going to send me to the office? No, sir. I'm going to send you to the restroom and let you clean up. So he gave it to him. Asked him. He said, it's his fault. You going to send me to the office? I said, no. I'm going to send you both to the restroom because you're gentlemen. And you've settled the disagreement, haven't you? Yeah. Okay. Well, when they both went to the restroom, washed up, and came back, nobody ever did anything in my classroom again to bother me.
And then back to Mr. Frank. What else do you
Oh,
know about Mr.
well,
Frank?
from him I picked up a lot of my teaching techniques and treating people, because he knew when to put the pressure, and, you know, I studied everybody that I had in class, you know, for teachers, and I picked all these things up.
Can you tell me some stories that your grandparents told you about pioneer life in Oklahoma?
No, all my grandparents were dead until 1924, and my grandpa, that was kin of Davy Crockett, lived in Texas with my uncle, and they didn't tell me. But I did talk to, there was a man that worked in the uniform department where they gave us uniforms because we had to be military, you know, up at Stillwater. He rode with Custer, but he was sick the time Custer went off and got butchered up, and so he was still living. And Uncle Bill Ross.
What was his name?
Just Uncle Bill. He was the neighbor.
Ross. His name was Ross, and we called him Uncle Bill. And he would take me to rodeos, and he would introduce me to people that were, you know, that knew Indians and so on. And across the street from our house in the cow pasture was a buffalo wallow. Now, a buffalo wallow is about 10 or 12 feet in diameter, and sometimes 3 feet deep. And the grass grew, and when it rained, that water would be nice and clean, and I'd run and jump in there on the belly and bend as much as I could, and I'd splash all the way across. And it was fun. But sometimes people would, and one man told me the story of a mason, and he was on the prairies, and the Indians came up, and he thought they were going to butcher him, and he gave the Masonic sign of distress, and those Indians gave him the same sign back. I don't know what it is, and they didn't bother him. And in my research, I ran across Isom Dart, and he was in the Civil War as a kid, and the Northern men would give him favors for seeding chickens and potatoes and apples and things from plantations. They wouldn't have to go out and get them, see? And so when the war was over, he went west, and he stole horses and cattle. The sheriff went out to get him, manacled him, put him in a wagon, started back, and the horses bolted, turned the wagon over, injured the sheriff. He caught the horses, brought them back, hitched them up, righted the wagon, and brought the sheriff in town. They said, we can't kill a guy that saved our sheriff's life. Now, if you promise not to steal in our county, we'll turn you loose. So that's what they did.
What was his name?
Isom Dart. And then I did the Buffalo Soldier. And a man in California was a Nairobi Wrangler, and he sang on TV and made up stories and songs. He worked for the Geological Department of the government. And so I used him as a model. The 6th, the 9th, and 10th Cavalry Regiment made up of blacks. And General Pershing, you know, the First World War general, I thought they named him Blackjack because he was the last officer, but that wasn't the reason. He played cards, and then he got the name from that. But anyway, he chased Pancho Villa back to Mexico, and then they disbanded. So I made a bust of him, and I presented it to the, he brought it back and gave it to the Langston University, because he graduated with Dr. Holloway, and Dr. Holloway's president there, and so, well, anyway, I like to think of myself as a portrait, memorial portraits, like Johnny Appleseed went around planting apples, that I'm planting all these things around.
Let's backtrack
Okay.
just a moment to Mr. Frank, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do. I just remember that after World War II, and they had the GI training, that when he was at Sapulpa, that was one thing that kept his pottery shop going for a while, wasn't it? Was
Yes.
the money that he received from the government for each GI that he was training, he would receive so much money. And of course, it was a two-way street in helping a lot of people. Now, if you can embellish
He
on
did
that.
tell me, he said, Andy, I've done all that I wanted to do when he was dying of cancer. And the last I saw him, he was in bed, and I knelt down by his bed, and we prayed together. And I went back home, and the night he died, I woke up choking. And that's the way I'm told that he passed away, that he woke up and he was choking to death.
I'd like to add.
Didn't have a phone.
I'd like to add one thing. He has two daughters. The one that I know, Donna Frank, she wrote a most beautiful book about her father.
Clay in the potter's hands.
Clay in the hands of the master.
Yeah, that's right.
And
John East is running the factory.
If you read that book, I tell you, if you don't have a lump in your throat, it's just a beautiful portrait of her father.
And
So-
Donna is running the foundry, the factory now.
Not Donna, her sister.
John East.
John East, her
Yes.
sister, John East.
Um,
She was the one that always was at her father's heels ever since she was a child in the pottery factory, and she went on through college majoring in art, and so she could be her father's helper. And of course, when her father passed away, and she was able to carry on with the family business. And about a year ago, wasn't it?
It burned down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it burned to the ground, and of course, the sister was determined to come back, and they have rebuilt, and
You know, every time I need plaster to make a mold or clay, I go over there to buy it, and John East won't take my money. She says, it's no good.
it's counterfeit.
And I went up to Huska to get them to start a foundry in Guthrie, and he said no, and I said, how about a branch up there, and I'll run it for you. He says no. He says, how would you like to come up here and learn all you don't know about foundry so you could start one there in Guthrie? And I said, how much is it going to cost? He said, have I said anything about money? So I went up there and worked about 2 months. And then one day, a fellow told me about a man over in eastern Oklahoma, and I went over to see him, and he has some obsolete equipment that can be fixed up, and so I've got a 1909 bandsaw that I'm going to put in this foundry. And what I want is the high school kids and grade school kids and the public to come there and see the foundry as closely as it was operating in 1900.
That's in Guthrie.
Yes, and so it's a historical and educational and a money-making, you know.
How big was Cheyenne when you two were kids?
It's not too much bigger now that I remember it, and I must tell a rather interesting story. A number of years ago, it seems to me it was in the 40s, or early 50s, that we decided instead of we were both living in California at the time, Los Angeles area, and we decided to come home for whatever reason, and on the way back we decided we'd go through Cheyenne, which was off of Route 66, and not knowing just where our cousin Speck, who is Jim Lester's son, and not knowing where his farm was, we thought we had asked some of the townspeople. Now, if I remember right, the town was like 1 block or 2 blocks long, no more than 2 blocks long as far as buildings, and I don't think there was any more than 2-story building in the lot.
You could spit down Main Street and not hit anybody.
Okay, put it that's another way to put it. And so we thought, well, we'll stop at the drugstore somewhere and ask which direction is Speck Lester's farm. And as we were walking down the street, incidentally, it was my younger brother, both brothers, and myself. And as we were walking down the street, this man was walking towards us, and he looked at it, the three of us, and he says, you folks are Lesters, aren't you? The resemblance. So then Andy got to talking, and then you can carry on from there.
Well, one time I went back to an old church that we used to go to on
wasn't
Capitol
it-
Hill. Wait a minute, this is on my mind right now. And I was sitting in there, and the church hadn't started yet, and a woman walked up and tapped me on the shoulder. She says, "You're not Bill Lester, but you're his son." I said, "How'd you know?" She said, "Your hair is just like your daddy's. You're bald, and just in the same way and everything." She could tell.
But it turned out this man wasn't, was it his wife or his mother was the midwife when you were born?
His mother.
His mother was the midwife
Yeah.
when Andy was born. So he took us out to the spot. Andy wanted to see the spot where the dugout was, where he was born. So he took us out there and showed us. But first thing he says, "Shucks, it won't do you any good to go out there." He says he's not home. He's somewhere else. But he did take us. He says, "How would you like for me to take you down to the old courthouse and look around?" It was very old. I don't know how many years it's been standing there. Anyway, he said, "You'd probably like to see pictures of your uncle." So there was this little ledge that they had around the wall with pictures leaning against it. Sure enough, there were a few there of Uncle Jim. Then he said, "Would you like to see the jail?" So we walked out, the old jail. So we walked outside, and we passed a half dugout that had an iron door, but it was open, halfway open. So we said, "Well, why do you keep there?" He says, "That's where we keep all the county records." Is the door open? He says, "Shucks. No use locking it. Everybody knows what everybody else owns. It doesn't do any good to lock it." Now, this was in the early 50s. Then we went on around and peeked in the jail, which reminds me of a story. When we were quite young, there were 5 of us kids, and we were active children. And he had, I think, 5 at the time, too. There were 5 of them. So you get 10 kids together, and you've got a lot of commotion. So I guess we kids were getting a little bit underfoot, so he says, probably told the women folks, "I'll take care of these kids." So he walked us over to the jail. And we looked in, and he says, "Want to see what jail looks like?" "Well, curiosity, sure." He says, "You can't see it out there real good. Come on. Come on inside. You can see it real good." So by the time we got in, I don't remember how many of the 10 of us were there, but he got us in, and then he stepped out and shut the door. He says, "Now I know where you are." So we can't ever say we were never in jail. And the old jail is still there. And Speck, his nickname, because he was so freckled, which is Bob Lester's brother, of course.
They used to say anybody that's got a lot of freckles, the cow is eating bran, and she belched and coughed and
blew bran in his face. That's me too. I had so many freckles when I was a kid, as the other brother, younger.
What did you two do during World War II?
Okay, during World War II, I worked part of the time at Curtis Studio, which was in the Atco Tower, and I felt I was contributing sort of to the war effort, because taking pictures of the servicemen, I would think, well, maybe this is the only picture the family will have. And I worked there for about a year, and during the early part of the war, I was not a member of the Beta Sigma Phi sorority. Our older sister was, and I was included in some of the activities. So we would entertain servicemen with dances and so forth. And I have a friend, Eleanor Curry was her maiden name. She lived, of course, in Oklahoma City. She's now in California, married. And she was a member of the YWCA and was very active in the talent club in the YWCA. And so I would also join some of the functions that they would have in entertaining the servicemen. Of course, I didn't think I sang very well, but it was a little encouragement from her and some of the other talent. And we would go out to the different bases, and I would do a little bit of USO work. They had a small USO, and it seems to me it was kind of close to the Skirvin Hotel. And we'd go there and talk to the men and archery and so forth and so on. But during the wartime, I made 5 round trips between Los Angeles and Oklahoma City, trying to decide which was home. And when I returned to Los Angeles, I joined what they call the Wadka, Women's Ambulance and Defense Corps of America. And we had real sharp uniforms, similar. They were sort of khaki color, but better looking even than the wax uniforms. And I remember one time we walked down Hollywood, we marched down Hollywood Boulevard for a premiere for the picture Iwo Jima. And we were with the Marines, we were their guests. And as we were walking down the parade down Hollywood Boulevard to the theater, Brahman's Chinese Theater, I remember people were asking, what outfit are you from? So we girls made up that we would already have an answer for them, Foreign Legion. And also, with this group, on Saturday nights, we would go to the Masonic Temple, Hollywood Masonic Temple, the Saturday night dances, and then on Sundays, they would bus us out to Corona Hospital, where we would write letters, talk to the servicemen, sew on their buttons, or whatever that there was to do. Just someone to visit them was wonderful. And then I also remember I lived in Highland Park, which was not too far from Pasadena, and our ceramic shop, as Andy mentioned earlier, was in Pasadena. And I remember one time riding the bus. This man, serviceman, got on the bus, and he was in the process of plastic surgery being perfected to his face, and it was kind of a sad sight. And then I learned later, and we also visited, there was a hotel which was on Colorado Boulevard near Orange Grove in Colorado, where the Rose Parade starts. And there was a very lovely hotel at that time that they converted into a hospital at that time. And that's what they had in this hospital. They were, it was sort of the foundation, early foundation of plastic surgery. And we girls would go there and talk to the men, read to them, or write letters for them, or whatever. And however, they wouldn't let us up on some of the floors because some of the men were in such terrible condition that they didn't want anyone to see them, and of course that was understandable. And one night I remember we were bussed out to March Air Force Base, and because this group of soldiers, that was their last night stateside. The next morning they were being shipped out. I remember there were probably at least 200 there at the recreation hall, and there were probably about 14 of us. We were the only ones that could go that particular night. It was during the week, and that was quite a long drive. Those days they didn't have freeway. And I was the only one that could jitterbug. And if you think, being popular, 200 men, and among that, at least 50 that wanted to jitterbug. But it was one night of really being very popular. And well, let's see. I do remember very vividly VE Day when peace was declared, and Hollywood and Vine was the place to be. So my other sister and I, she had a car, and so we drove over to Hollywood, and I tell you, Hollywood and Vine was pandemonium. I remember walking down the street, and this one lieutenant, I think he was a Marine lieutenant, he just took his bars off and pinned them on me and gave me a kiss and went on his way. You didn't think anything about someone grabbing you and kissing you then. Everybody was happy. And one little, there was an English sailor, he took off his little sailor hat that had HMS, His Majesty's ship. He took that off and put that on my head and went on his way. He says, I don't want that anymore. And, just story after story. And back to this uniform that we had, I just remembered a little kind of an interesting story. Our younger brother was living in San Diego at the time, working for Consolidated Aircraft. He wanted to join the service, the Air Corps especially, but they wouldn't release him because he was in doing necessary work.
And colorblind.
Yes, he was a little colorblind too, just different shades. Anyway, yeah, but he did eventually, along the end of the war, about a year and a half before, 2 years before it was over, he did quit and he joined the Army because they didn't accept him by that point in time. But in order for me to go down to San Diego to visit him, it was a little difficult as a civilian in just regular street clothes because only military could travel easily on buses or trains. So what I would do, kind of sneaky, but I didn't, wanted to go see my brother, and so I'd put on my uniform and go down to either the bus station, whichever I was going, the train or the bus, and felt pretty confident I would get on, which of course I would, and naturally, it being a different uniform would attract the other servicemen. They're waiting for transportation, and so they'd come up and ask what outfit I was in. Of course, I would tell the truth eventually. At first, I'd say, well, Foreign Legion, and I'd tell the truth.
Now, what's the name of the unit again?
Women's Women's Ambulance and Defense Corps of America. And also we took a training program with the Red Cross in case we were bombed, so what to do in case of that emergency. So we had different activities, and of course we learned how to march and all that. So with this uniform, I never had a problem getting on a bus or train, either the fact that I had the uniform on or the servicemen come along and say, well, if you have a problem, you're my wife until we get on, and then I'll divorce you.
My brother was working for Consolidated. I was in Oklahoma, and the NYA project was closed down. So my wife and children went to live with her mother on a farm near Okema. And a woman was driving to San Diego to be with her family, so I drove the car for transportation. And I went to work as a sheet metal for 80 cents an hour. And then I went to work, I didn't like that, and I went to work for production illustration, showing by sketching how the thing goes together, because it couldn't read blueprints. And then I asked for a transfer to the plaster department. I became a plaster pattern maker. And then when I'd see the civilian wives and sweethearts and single women walking along the street, and Marines and other servicemen would grab them and kiss them and want them to make out right there on the street, I didn't want to bring my family to San Diego, so I went to LA, and I got a job in a private place, not a big place, and then it was a pattern making, and I became foreman. And then when I was interested in ceramics, I knew the war was going to be over pretty quick, and the salesman knew a company that wanted someone who understood the production in military to convert to a ceramic plant. So I went to work for them for $2.50 an hour.
What did you do during the war at the pattern?
I made patterns, and they didn't tell us what they were for, but I knew that they sucked air in, and they were patterns for the jet plane. The first jet plane, I made the patterns for it. And some of the, when you'd make a pattern, it looked almost like a abstract shape in art, and they wouldn't fit together exactly, so we'd have to freehand them in. And so sculpturing was very effective. And then the big transport plane for military, I made the first patterns for that too.
Oh, that reminds me. Oh no, this is after the war ended. That I worked for Cannon Electric, which was they made plugs from T90 to this size, and I remember a large plug was made for the rockets. You know, with all the little prongs and everything. And that just brought to mind getting.
When I started the pottery factory, she came to work then for me.
Yes.
That's why you moved to California.
Well, that wasn't really why.
Her sister was there.
Well, my sister was there, and her husband had gone in the service. As I said, between 1940 and 1945, I made 5 round trips, 6 months, 9 months, and so forth in the 2 different places. But I think, I shouldn't say think, the reason really why I stayed in California was my sister had a baby, and her husband was in the service, and I just felt that she needed me there. And so between the 2 of us, we brought up this beautiful child, though her husband, and she divorced when the child was about 3. And then I stayed on living with her and stayed with her until she was 12 and my sister remarried.
Did you have much trouble traveling between Oklahoma City and California during the war?
No.
It seemed real easy.
No, I can say that I didn't.
By automobile too.
Well, yes, I went by train 1 or 2 times. I went by bus once, I think only once. But generally, sometimes I would know someone that was making the trip, and so I would pay them so much to help them with their gas money.
If you had a C ration instead of an A ration, you could save up those tickets enough to get across the country.
But then some people didn't have very much money, so I would pay part towards the gas for.
Now, why did you join the ambulance corps?
I just felt like it was an important thing to do. It was a nice thing to do, and incidentally, just recently, and just last week, I was accepted. I am now a volunteer at Bob Hope's USO in Hollywood. I don't know yet what I will be doing because I just recently had the idea to join, and what prompted that was I was a shutterbug early on, before the war. My first job was working in a Kodak finishing, MacArthur Kodak finishing, which was on Linwood and something I've forgotten the other street. But that was my very first job while I was still in high school. You know, like after the first snow, they'd be very busy. Easter, a lot of business, and then in the summers. So through that, I became quite a shutterbug. And sometimes I would see pictures come through that someone had taken a faraway places, and I had the bug I wanted to travel. And so I would make another picture of a picture that I would want, and consequently through this same vein, I would make extra pictures for myself when Bob Hope was taking his USO tours, and I had several pictures of like Jerry Colonna, Bob Hope, Francis Langford, and different people in his entourage. And I was sort of, now that I'm retired, I was kind of cleaning house and memorabilia, and I pulled out those pictures. I thought, now what do I want to do with those? I hate to throw them away. And then I had the idea. I'm at the USO right now. Of course, it was the Hollywood Canteen during the war. And I thought, I think they would like that. So I took them down, and they were thrilled to have them. And then they said to me, I mentioned I was retired. Well, how would you like to volunteer here? I said, well, I don't know. I can dance and I can type, and I'm a retired secretary bookkeeper of many years, and that was what I learned to do later after the Kodak finishing and the portrait finishing in studio. And so whatever, I don't know what I will be doing for them, but I took these pictures down, and they were thrilled to have them. They sent me a little certificate, and then they posed the planted the little seed. How would you like to be a volunteer? And I said, well, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it, but I'll try it. And I took the uniform down. I still had the uniform that I had, you know, the little hat and the emblem and all that. And I took that down just as an interest and showed it to them. And I said, you know, if you want it, you can have it, because what am I going to do with it? Would you believe it? It still fits. I can still wear it. I weigh the same as I did then, 102 pounds. And
You know, I saw Bob Hope in Vietnam.
Oh, back to Bob Hope just a moment. When Andy's son, we nicknamed Beaver because he looked like Little Beaver of early television. And he was about 6 years old, wasn't he? And he was a mascot of the school there. And he had
Palm Springs Indians.
Palm Springs Indians. And he had the you know, feathers and the regalia and everything. And at that time, Palm Springs had one season. Now they have a season that may start in April, and they may have another one that, ends in April, and another date, and starts at September to something, or October, November. They had more than one date, but then the season started was the first day of October, and ended May 30th. And so for the beginning of the season, they would always have this big parade, and they would always have some important person as a grand marshal, or whatever name they called it. And it was Bob Hope this particular year. And of course, Little Beaver headed the parade, and then Bob Hope was in the car right behind him. And they got to the end of the parade ground, and Bob Hope came up to Beaver and says, boy, you sure can dance fast. He was doing the Indian dance, and Beaver looked up at him and says, well, the pavement was hot. So remembering Bob Hope and back to Little Beaver, and I've kind of wondered if Bob Hope, I think he would remember that. Now he has this big home there.
You say it's the beginning of the season. What?
The beginning of the season.
Well, it's when it got cooler.
It's when it
120 in the shade in the summertime in Palm Springs.
It's very hot. Yes, very hot. So people say who live in like Oklahoma or Chicago or New York, by October the 1st it starts winter. See. And so they want to go where the sun is, where they can lay out in the sun and say, send pictures home, you know, laid by the swimming pool, you're there in the ice and the snow, and then it would start getting hot by by May. I don't know if it's May 1 or May 30th, anyway,
Well,
May. And if I remember right...
Usually Easter they started fading away.
If I remember right, you said, when you were teaching there, that regular residents was about 1,000, and but during the season there was about 10,000. And Palm Springs, when I first saw it, and you were down there, that was...
There was desert between Palm Springs and Desert Hot Springs and other little towns, and now it's solid.
Well, what I remember was Palm Canyon Drive didn't have meters, and it was about 6 blocks long. And of course now it's, like you say, it's just...
Well, you see, the Indian Avenue was the beginning of the Indian Reservation, and when the federal government decided to allow the Indians to rent and lease their land for a 99-year lease, I told the kids, I said, you're going to start leasing that, and you're not going to be you're not going to afford to live in Palm Springs. And within 6 months, they couldn't.
And where the Spa Hotel is now, which was originally, according to what was told to me, I didn't see it as factual evidence, but what was told to me was that Frank Sinatra built the Spa Hotel, and there's a natural mineral spring there.
And the sand is so warm that people get in that sand and soak it and it heals them.
The Indians, see, that was what the Indians used, to heal themselves. And then, of course, Frank Sinatra put up the money to build there, and now it's a health spa. And thinking of this is a little bit interesting too. At least it is to me. It must have been at least 15 years ago or so. A friend and I drove down to Palm Springs, and we just curiosity. We want to see where Frank Sinatra lived. We knew he lived down there on the edge of a golf course, being a golfer. So logically, why wouldn't it be on Frank Sinatra Drive? We had heard it was on Frank Sinatra Drive. So we get on Frank Sinatra Drive, and we didn't know which house was his, so we stopped and we asked. Oh, no. We were on Frank Sinatra Drive, and we saw it going right up the desert, kind of a slow rise. And we looked up there, and all around, I couldn't tell you how many acres was just desert. And then right in the middle was like an oasis. From where we were, probably 4 or 5 miles back, it was just a patch of green. That's got to be Frank Sinatra, all this security. So we drive up, and the gate was open, and we drive in. And the guard, he didn't come running out, but at that time I had a little black Corvair, and we just drove in, and I saw a guard come out, and so I stopped, and he looked at us, and he says, may I ask you girls what you're looking for? We said, well, now we don't want to bother him. That isn't the idea. We were just curious what his house looked like. He says, what do you mean? Well, we just thought this is where Frank Sinatra lived. He says, oh no, this is Mr. Annenberg's estate. Of course, you know who Mr. Annenberg is. He's
a friend of the president's.
Well, he's a friend of the president, but he's an ex-ambassador to Great Britain, to England. And if a person was to try to do that, they would never get in. And the fellow, he was we were laughing, and he was laughing. We said, well, do you know which house is Frank Sinatra's? And he saw we were innocent. And he said, yeah, you go down this way, and his is the pink one, and so forth and so on. So then he just let us drive out. But it's the grounds, it's, like I say, it's absolutely like paradise. Flowers and greenery. And so we went back down the hill and saw the house that he described, and just drove by. We're not one to go up and knock on doors, and we saw Liberace's home while down there, and it was...
When I went to Palm Springs to teach, I started as a carpenter, and I worked as a carpenter every summer.
And that's hot. But
and I worked on Frank Sinatra's house.
But it's...
As a rough carpenter.
It's a dry heat. It's very dry. Not to say 110 the shade.
And in the summertime at night, the mountains look like iridescent, jagged pieces of glass sticking up from the sand.
It really is beautiful. And
verbena in the spring, it smells beautiful.
And early time, in the late 40s, is when we were there, naturally there weren't very many people there, so there were not many lights. And you look up at the sky, and it was just black velvet with the stars shining. I would say the only place I've seen anything similar is when I was in Tahiti, on the island of Tahiti. You look up, it's just velvet with just.
And during the time I was there, Bob Hope would bring his group in there, and we'd have an assembly, and it would be a live assembly for broadcast, because he loved the high school kids' reaction to everything.
And Andy was president of the Allied Arts Association, which, so he was always the master of ceremonies for, they only had one theater then, and they would show movies at night, well, certain nights or Sundays or whatever, but if they had a special guest, like I remember I went down once when Reza Stevens was performing, so when they had special entertainment, it was always done there. And I think there was one nightclub called the Dollhouse, and it was.
And the other thing that's real interesting is when I went to this high school, the teacher would kick a kid out of class for a minor infraction, and he'd be out of school. I went to the principal and I said, you know, you're losing ADA. If the teacher agrees and the kid agrees to come to my arts and crafts and not crow about it, not create a problem for the other teacher, will you leave him in school? Yes. Well, it wasn't long till I had kids in there half a day. They didn't like the teacher didn't like them, and the teacher's glad to be rid of them. And so I went to the principal and I said, the kids are bringing them the homework. If they do the homework and hand it in to you and you grade it, then they come to your office and take the final test the teacher gives, and they make at least a B on it. Will you see if they get credit as if they were in her class all the time? He said, yes. Well, I was 30 years ahead of my time, because now they've got a master plan in California that they use a resource specialist to mastermind the curriculum of the kid, and they are more important than a principal or a dean or a vice principal or anyone else. And what they say go, because they get an agreement between the kid, the family, and the resource specialist. And
How come you moved back to Oklahoma?
This is my real root. And my wife is 20 years younger than I. We taught 10 years together, and she refused to come back. And so I came back anyway.
Is your wife still in California?
Yes.
And why did you choose Guthrie?
When I came here, I met Pauline Lane. In 1982, I was in touch with the Jim Thorpe children, and they told me they wanted me here when they got their medals back, because it's 1982 is the 75th birthday of Oklahoma. So corresponding with them, I came back and brought a bust, and they wanted to show it. And they showed it at the reception. And Pauline Lane was a president of the 89ers Association, and at the time that I came back, she was the treasurer. Yes, the treasurer. And she said, Andy, you should see Don Coffin, the bank vice president in Guthrie. You should see Fred Oles. You should see Penn Woods. Well, I met all those people. And when I met Dan Coffin, he had a barn. He said, come on, let's look at this barn and see if this is where you'd like to have your foundry. He said, you clean it up. And so we made a deal. Then he asked me to go up to Pawhuska to see if that foundry would come down. And so I went up there and learned how to cast and all these things, and had my pieces cast up there. And then I met this man over at Haskell. And Guthrie is the home of the, I mean, that's where the Oklahoma began in '89. And somebody said, you ought to, if I were here, I'd be a small
duck in a big puddle.
That's right.
Up there
and nobody would know where I'm located, and I'd have to have money, and I'd have to have all of these things. And up there, they're struggling to, you know, to come alive again. And where there's a struggle, I guess I got this old stream of go west. Well, I had to come east to go west. And Oklahoma's reviving itself, and I think it's going to be the Paris of the prairies and the Williamsburg of the west, and I just feel.
Well, what else do you want to talk about?
Well, I think we've reached our theme.
Well, basically, my theme is portrait memorials of those who made history, changed it, and lived it. For those who remember and wish to be. patrons and sponsors of scholarships, these are our living memorials. And I believe, and 1983 is the year of the Bible. 1984 should be, or should have been, the year of the 4 R's, the heritage of our ancestry. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. Because that guaranteed the free press, that guaranteed law rather than man, that guaranteed education, and that guaranteed that you've got to believe in and live it for more than what is within your own skin. Because unless you invest in the future, your memory is going to die with you. But if you invest in the future, your memory lives on in the lives of other people who aren't even aware of it, perhaps. And we're grateful for you that we met you and your interest in the oral history. And I had an accident in '76. I lost all my memory. It injured the left hemisphere. My logic and reasoning was gone. I had to retire from teaching. We moved to Yosemite area just in time for the 1979 125th anniversary of Mariposa County, which was the mother of counties. And the earliest newspaper and earliest courthouse still in existence is in that town. I became the official sculptor. I did 10 portraits of 5 historical periods from prehistorical down to the present day. And I couldn't remember how I did portraits, and I didn't have pictures of Tenaya, and I wanted to do something for the Indians. And so one night after I went to bed, and I thought, Lord, I leave it in your hands every time it turns out just right, so tomorrow morning you're going to have it in my head how I'm going to do this portrait of Tenaya without a picture. If the Indians had told me that his great-great-great-grandson was alive and looked like him, I'd have gone to him, but they didn't tell me that. So I said, tomorrow it's going to be in my head. So tomorrow it was. Go to the library at the park. Go to the park, go to the library, ask for the first photograph of Indians. Pick the one with the kindest, wisest, and most gentle eyes. And pick a mouth that could say, kill me too, sir, Captain. You kill the child of my heart, why not kill the father? My spirit will haunt you, and you will fear the old chief. So after I did that, I picked cheekbones and ears and other parts of faces and made a composite, twice larger than life size. After I finished it, I saw a man at the station. I said, hey, you look like my Tenaya. He said, you're the sculptor, aren't you? I said, yes, sir. He said, ought to be. I'm the 3rd generation grandson. And so I waited till 1981, so it'd be even 130 years since he died, and I presented it to them for their Indian Cultural Center in the park. And they adopted me. My name is Ahele. And so when I asked what it was, they said, coyote. But you know, coyotes in Oklahoma are not very honorable animals, you know. And they saw my face, and they said, but here in the park, he's the wisest, and he's a survivor. And we didn't want to call you grizzly bear because you're not aggressive and you're not a killer. And those are the only 2 we really honor. There's owls and others. And so when they said that, I said, I'll buy it.
Well, without sounding prejudiced, I haven't heard any of your other interviews, but I do believe this interview with my brother is the most productive that you have had.
Very good.
Well, I mean, she's been a supporter. Now, when I was working my way through college, and my sisters would see me needing a pair of shoes or something, they'd come along and, you know. And then when I started working at Stillwater, Mrs. Dan Deal and her husband was a field representative for farmers out in western Oklahoma, and my grandpa knew him, and he knew my grandpa. And I didn't know that until after Mr. Deal passed away. And one day she said, Andrew, come on with me. She went down to Cat's department store, and she said, pick out your suit. I said, I can't afford this. She says, you're working for me, pick it out. And she outfitted me from the top of my head to the bottom. I mean, shoes, socks, underwear, suit and tie and shirt. And I mean, people have been good to me. And so I owe people. You know something? When we get an education, the streets, we didn't plan that. We didn't work that. Somebody else did that for us. Well, it's time we gave. Instead of demanded money for everything, it's time we gave. This is not a time that money flows freely, and that's what I want to do. I want to give.
Well, money doesn't buy everything.
And then when I had this stroke friend came by, knew I was there. He broke in and clothed me and took me to the hospital.
September of this year, he had a mini stroke.
And they didn't even ask for money, and I left. They didn't even demand money. And then they sent me a letter, but I got Blue Cross and I got Medicare. That takes care of everything just about.
That's good.
And well, my grandson, David, Knife Chief, in California, he was All-American linebacker for the Little League, you know, All-American. And some senator here sent a letter back to him because he wanted him to come to Oklahoma. And so now they live in Pawnee, and he's in high school there. And I sure hope, I hope he's an All-American college.
Well, I want to thank you.
Well,
You
it
betcha.
was our pleasure